In the summer of 1943, under the blinding flashbulbs of Los Angeles, Betty Grable stood at the height of America's desire. Her legs were insured for $1 million, a symbol of perfection in a world at war. Soldiers carried her photograph across oceans, dreaming of the smile that promised home. But behind that flawless grin was a woman crumbling under control, exhaustion, and heartbreak. Her mother had built her, Hollywood had owned her, and fame had devoured what was left. Nights blurred into pills and silence, love into betrayal and smoke. Beneath the glitter of Fox Studios, Betty began to fade, a golden dream burning itself alive. Her story is not one of glamour, but of sacrifice, manipulation, and the slow decay of innocence. This is the untold truth of Betty Grable. Welcome to Hollywood Mysteries. She was born Elizabeth Ruth Grable in St. Paul, Louis, Missouri. A name far too ordinary for a woman destined to become the most photographed face of World War II. But her story didn't begin with lights and cameras. It began in the shadow of a mother's unfulfilled dream. Lillian Grable was a woman of fierce ambition, one who saw Hollywood not as a dream but as a battlefield. To her, Betty wasn't a child. She was a vessel for revenge against the world that had denied her own stardom. From the age of 3, Betty was drilled, molded, and trained like a soldier of show business. Dance lessons, acting rehearsals, voice exercises, all chosen by a mother who whispered, "Smile, darling. Pain looks ugly on camera." Hey, her father, John, stood on the opposite end of the spectrum. Quiet, detached, and increasingly irrelevant. When Lillian decided to move Betty to Los Angeles, John did not protest. He stayed behind, watching as his wife and youngest daughter vanished toward California. That absence would become one of the first wounds Betty would carry, the pain of being chosen for something, not by someone. At 12, Betty's childhood ended. Lillian, desperate to get her daughter into the studios, lied about her age, claiming she was 15 to bypass Hollywood's strict child labor laws. It was the first of many fabrications that would define Betty's early life. A pattern of manipulation disguised as opportunity. The lie worked. By 13, she was appearing in short films and chorus lines, surrounded by adult dancers, costumers, and men who looked at her with a hunger she did not yet understand. The pressure was relentless. Lillian's temper became infamous among casting agents. If Betty stumbled in rehearsal, she would feel the sting of her mother's voice. Sharp and merciless. "Do you know what I gave up for you?" Lillian would hiss backstage. One former dance instructor recalled the look in Betty's eyes after a particularly cruel outburst. She didn't cry. She just stopped breathing for a moment, as if she was learning how to disappear. Thus, years later, Betty would describe her mother as the driving force in her life. A polite euphemism for what was, in truth, a cycle of control. Lillian managed her contracts, chose her friends, and monitored her appearance with military precision. Her weight, her posture, her laugh, all calculated. Every inch of her daughter's body became a commodity. And yet, paradoxically, Lillian's obsession worked. Betty's legs, long, symmetrical, almost unnaturally perfect, became her golden ticket. Fox Studios would later insure them for $1 million, a publicity stunt that made her a national fantasy. But the irony was cruel. The same body that gave her power also imprisoned her. She would forever be defined by her physicality, never by her mind or her soul. Behind the glamour, her psyche began to fracture. Friends from her early studio days recalled her recurring nightmares. Being chased through empty sound stages, unable to find a door. Doctors later noted that she suffered from bouts of mild somnambulism, sleepwalking, and an acute fear of crowds. How ironic that the woman adored by millions was terrified of being seen. The studios noticed the cracks. In private memos, executives described her as high-strung and difficult to manage, code words for a woman collapsing under expectation. But the machine kept turning. Each time Betty faltered, Lillian would remind her, "I suffered agonies bringing you into this world. Don't you dare let me down again." That line, that curse, became the echo that followed Betty for life. By her late teens, Betty had learned how to survive in silence. She smiled on cue, laughed when told, flirted when necessary. Hollywood loved her compliance. They mistook it for charm. But inside, she was learning a darker truth. That in this industry, obedience was currency, and innocence was collateral damage. There's an unspoken tragedy in the making of a star. To rise, something pure must die. For Betty Grable, it was her sense of self. By the time America knew her name, the little girl from St. Tame, Louis had vanished completely, replaced by a creation that her mother, her studio, and her audience demanded. And somewhere inside that perfect smile, the first cracks of a lifetime's pain had already begun to show. By the early 1940 seconds, Betty Grable had become the heartbeat of America's war dream. Her name glittered across the marquees of 20th Century Fox. Her face graced the cover of Life magazine, and her smile, that famous, luminous smile, followed soldiers into battlefields half a world away. Yet what the world saw as triumph was, for Betty, another gilded cage. The transformation had not come easily. After years of chorus line anonymity, she finally caught her first major break in Down Argentine, Way 1940. The Technicolor palette adored her. That golden hair, the porcelain skin, the legs that seemed to defy gravity. Overnight, she was no longer the frightened girl from St. Louis. She was the girl with the $1 million legs. But behind the fantasy, exhaustion stalked her. Fox's grueling production schedule demanded precision, obedience, and a permanent smile. Betty was their perfect soldier. Tireless, punctual, loyal. But privately, she began to feel less like a woman and more like an artifact. The war years amplified her image to mythic proportions. When the United States entered World War II, her pin-up photo, a playful pose in a white bathing suit, looking over her shoulder, became the most requested image among troops. Over 5 million copies were printed. That single picture became both her crown and her curse. To every soldier, she was the girl waiting back home. The promise of innocence and desire blended into one impossible symbol. To Betty, it was another identity she had to maintain. Flawless, cheerful, eternally young. She knew the price of saying no. In Hollywood's golden era, rebellion wasn't a luxury. It was a career death sentence. When she once refused a role she felt was demeaning, studio head Daryl F. Zanuck reminded her that there's always another blonde waiting. The message was clear. She wasn't unique, only useful. So she smiled again, performed again, and hid her fatigue behind charm. The more famous she became, the smaller her real world grew. Fox controlled her image down to the inch. Diet, hair color, wardrobe, even who she dated. The studio arranged public appearances, charity tours, and military morale events that left her physically drained. She was expected to embody perfection, not personhood. And while the world adored her, no one noticed that she was quietly vanishing inside her own reflection. It was around this time that she met bandleader Harry James, the trumpet legend, whose charisma was as dazzling as his recklessness. Their courtship played like a Hollywood dream, America's sweetheart and its golden boy of swing. They married in 1943, a wartime union that seemed to promise safety, family, and love. But behind closed doors, the harmony faltered. Harry's gambling and heavy drinking soon became public secrets whispered across studio corridors. Betty, now balancing film shoots, motherhood, and the facade of a perfect marriage, began to crumble under invisible weight. Still, she worked. Always. Her films. Moon Over Miami, Pinup Girl, Mother Wore Tights. Broke box office records. In 1947, she was the highest paid woman in America, earning over $300,000 a year. On paper, she had everything: money, fame, beauty, family. But beneath that empire was fatigue so deep it bordered on despair. Friends recalled her staring blankly at her reflection between takes, murmuring, "I don't even know who's looking back at me." Stay so. Hollywood loved to celebrate its women, but only when they stayed silent. Betty's contracts contained morality clauses that dictated her behavior even off-set. When rumors of marital strife reached gossip columns, the studio intervened, demanding that she appear in public with Harry, smiling, arm in arm. Image first, her publicist warned. Truth, never. She obeyed, as she always had. But each staged photograph chipped another piece off her spirit. Her discipline was legendary. She never arrived late, never complained about long shooting hours, never allowed the mask to slip. But her body began to betray her. Years of exhaustion and poor sleep left her reliant on barbiturates and alcohol. Not in excess, but enough to function, enough to stay awake, enough to sleep. "They give us pills for everything," one co-star remembered her saying. To dance, to stop crying, to keep smiling. Stay so. In her rare moments of solitude, Betty longed for something normal, a life without cameras, without her mother's demands or the studio's gaze. She often retreated to her dressing room just to sit in silence. A hairdresser once walked in and found her humming to herself, tears streaking her foundation. When asked what was wrong, Betty whispered, "Nothing. It's just that sometimes the lights feel heavier than the dark." Stay so. Despite the cracks forming beneath her image, her popularity never faded. During the late 1940 seconds, she was not merely an actress. She was an institution. American GIs called her their lucky star. Fox executives referred to her as the cash machine. But to Betty, those titles felt hollow. She had become a product of everyone else's desire, a symbol she no longer controlled. By the time Marilyn Monroe entered the scene at the start of the 1950 seconds, a generational shift was underway. The studio system that had built Betty was now devouring her. Younger, bolder faces were replacing the icons of the war era. Monroe herself once said she looked up to Grable, calling her a warm, wonderful person. Betty smiled at the compliment, but privately confessed to a friend, "She's what I used to be, and what they'll bury me as." I gotta face a tearing. The sacrifice of fame wasn't just physical or emotional. It was existential. Every applause felt like a farewell, every photograph like a tombstone for another piece of herself. When she walked off a soundstage for the last time in the early 1950 seconds, the silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was deafening. She had spent her life performing happiness. And now, she didn't know how to live without pretending. Her rise had been glorious, but the cost was irreversible. The little girl from Missouri had fulfilled her mother's dream, her nation's fantasy, and her studio's greed. But no one had asked what she dreamed of. And when the lights finally dimmed, Betty Grable was left alone with the only truth Hollywood never wanted to see, that the woman who had made America smile no longer remembered what joy felt like. For the world, Betty Grable and Harry James were Hollywood's golden couple. The trumpet king and the pin-up queen, the glamorous duo who embodied America's post-war dream. But behind their radiant smiles and magazine covers lay a marriage built on cracks so deep, even love couldn't seal them. They met when the world was still burning. 1,942. He was already a star, his name synonymous with swing and champagne nights. She was the girl whose smile kept soldiers alive through black and white postcards. When Harry James played, the room vibrated. When Betty entered, it glowed. Their chemistry was undeniable. Two bright, reckless souls drawn together by the same addiction, applause. But fame, as always, demands a sacrifice. And theirs would be each other. At first, Betty found in Harry what she had never known: laughter, spontaneity, the illusion of being loved without conditions. He adored her energy, her optimism, her loyalty. But Harry's charm came with shadows. He drank too much, gambled obsessively, and collected women the way others collected records. The world adored his music, but it was his silence that destroyed their home. The first cracks appeared quietly. Late-night rehearsals that bled into morning absences. Bank accounts drained without explanation. When Betty confronted him, Harry smiled that disarming musician's smile and said, "Don't worry, baby. It's all part of the act." But the act never stopped. By 1946, rumors swirled across studio lots. Affairs, debts, and whispered fights that even the studio's publicity team couldn't conceal. Fox executives begged her to keep up appearances. America needed its sweetheart unblemished, not broken. And so she smiled for the cameras again, diamonds on her wrist, bruises on her heart. Friends would later recall the dinner parties. Betty pouring drinks for guests while Harry flirted openly across the table. She laughed too loudly, moved too quickly, desperate to hold the illusion together. She wasn't hosting, one friend said. She was performing. The emotional cruelty cut deeper than betrayal. Harry's words could slice through her composure with surgical precision. "You'd be nothing without those legs," he once snapped during an argument. It was a line she never forgot. Years later, when her career waned and the studio replaced her with younger stars, she would repeat those words to herself in the mirror. Not as an insult, but as a prophecy fulfilled. Their daughters, Victoria and Jessica, became witnesses to the collapse. Tiny souls, growing up in a home that alternated between laughter and rage. Betty tried to hide the chaos behind normal routines: breakfast pancakes, bedtime kisses, nursery rhymes over the sound of jazz rehearsals echoing from downstairs. But children can sense when love becomes war. Harry's infidelities became an open secret. Actresses, dancers, waitresses. He left trails of perfume and unpaid bills wherever he went. Once, when Betty confronted a woman rumored to be his lover, the woman sneered. "He said you'd forgive him." "You always do." That was the night Betty smashed a glass against the wall and locked herself in the bathroom, sobbing until dawn. Her mother, Lillian, reappeared like a ghost during these years, always ready to remind Betty that she had warned her. "Men like him never stay," she'd say coldly. "But you chose him. You always choose wrong." To Lillian, every heartbreak was proof of control regained. To Betty, it was another chain tightening around her. By the early 1950s, their marriage had become a performance. A carefully choreographed lie. Publicly, they were radiant. Privately, they were exhausted. He sank deeper into gambling debts, she into anxiety and insomnia. Hollywood's golden couple was bleeding in silence. Betty began seeking refuge in her work again. Regional theater, nightclub performances, television appearances. Anything to remind herself that she still existed beyond the walls of that house. But the applause no longer healed. It merely postponed the inevitable. In 1953, Harry's debts caught up with them. The IRS seized assets, tabloids printed headlines of scandal, and the fairy tale officially disintegrated. Betty, who had built a career on loyalty, finally walked away. She filed for divorce after 22 years of marriage. When asked by a reporter what went wrong, she answered simply, "We just stopped listening to the same song." Black. Yet even in heartbreak, she couldn't escape the weight of expectation. The press painted her as the tragic housewife who couldn't tame the jazz genius. No one wrote about the sleepless nights, the panic attacks, or the way she kept Harry's trumpet on the piano long after he'd gone. Not as a memory, but as a warning. After the divorce, her circle of friends noticed a change. The once sparkling Betty became quieter, more fragile. "She used to light up a room," one colleague said. Now it looked like she was searching for the exit. She began avoiding social gatherings, declining interviews, slipping away from the public eye. But Hollywood doesn't forgive absence. It replaces it. Younger blondes. Monroe, Mansfield, Bardot filled the screen, each one echoing something Betty had once been. She watched silently as her own reflection multiplied, distorted, replaced. When Monroe's fame exploded, reporters asked Betty if she felt threatened. Her answer was gracious, but tinged with sorrow. "Honey, go and get yours. I had mine." Black. Behind that generosity lay resignation. She knew what the cameras could never capture. That every Hollywood story ends the same way. The applause fades, the audience leaves, and the lights turn cold. In the years that followed, Harry James tried to reconcile, then drifted back into the fog of addiction. Betty, though free on paper, remained haunted by the ghost of the life she'd built and lost. She once told a close friend, "I loved him more than I should have. I forgave him more than I could." That's the trouble with loving a man who plays music. You never know when he's done. Black. Her love story had begun like a song, and ended like an echo. It was the ultimate irony. The woman who taught America to dream of perfect romance had spent her life drowning in its ruin. And beneath the shimmer of her final curtain calls, Betty Grable carried a secret ache that not even fame, fortune, or forgiveness could silence. When the curtain finally fell on her golden years, Betty Grable did not collapse. She slowly disappeared. Hollywood had no ceremony for the fading of a star. It simply turned the lights towards someone younger. By the early 1960 seconds, her name still carried the shimmer of nostalgia, but the glamour had curdled into myth. She was no longer the girl with $1 million smile. She was the woman trying to remember who she had been beneath it. The decline came quietly, disguised as rest. After her divorce from Harry James in 1965, Betty withdrew from the spotlight. She told friends she was done chasing applause, yet her silence carried the heaviness of someone who had been defined entirely by it. Financial troubles mounted. Debts from years of supporting Harry's lifestyle and his gambling losses, combined with a dwindling income, forced her to take smaller stage and television roles. She toured nightclubs and small theaters, her voice trembling but her professionalism intact. "I still know how to hit my mark," she once said. "I just don't know why I still do." I know day, but the cracks were deepening. Years of chain smoking. A habit she picked up on film sets in the 1930 seconds, when cigarettes were handed out like candy, had begun to destroy her lungs. By her 50s, she was coughing blood, hiding it beneath makeup and rouge. Doctors urged her to stop smoking, to rest, to slow down. But how does one rest from a lifetime of performance? Betty brushed it off. "Everyone's dying of something," she joked bitterly. "At least I'll go out with lipstick on." I know day. Behind the bravado was terror. Her daughter spoke later of finding her sitting alone at night, chain-smoking in the dark, television flickering, surrounded by old fan letters. Sometimes she read them aloud. Words from soldiers, from men who had written her decades earlier, thanking her for helping them survive war. She kept them not as trophies, but as reminders that, once, she had mattered. When doctors diagnosed her with lung cancer in 1972, the news didn't shock her. "I always knew it would catch up," she told a close friend. But what stunned everyone was her reaction. She refused aggressive treatment. Radiation would damage her face. Chemotherapy would make her weak and unrecognizable. And Betty Grable, even in dying, couldn't bear to be seen as anything less than beautiful. "I've been a picture all my life," she said quietly. "I don't want them to remember me fading." I know day. Her decline was swift. By early 1973, she weighed barely 100 pounds. Yet she continued performing sporadically, appearing in Las Vegas and touring with stage productions like Guys and Dolls and Hello, Dolly. Every performance was a defiance of death, a gesture of stubborn grace. One reviewer wrote, "Her voice was softer now, her body frail, but when the lights hit her, something eternal lit up the stage." I know day. Still, the loneliness grew unbearable. Harry James, despite years of separation, returned briefly, visiting her bedside in Santa Monica. Witnesses described the moment as silent, almost surreal. The man who had once destroyed her spirit, now sitting beside her hospital bed, holding her hand in trembling guilt. He wept quietly. Betty, barely able to speak, smiled faintly and said, "Don't cry, Harry. You gave me music." It was the kind of forgiveness that only someone deeply wounded could offer. Her final months were marked by moments of eerie lucidity. Nurses recalled her waking from sleep to ask, "Is the camera still rolling?" Another time, she whispered, "Don't let them see me without the lights." Even at the edge of death, she was trapped in the illusion she had lived for decades. The need to be seen, to be flawless, to be adored. On the 2nd of July, 1973, at the age of 56, Betty Grable took her last breath in a Santa Monica hospital. There was no grand farewell, no studio tribute, no orchestra swell. Just silence. The woman who had once embodied the dream of millions left the world as quietly as she had entered it. Her funeral was small, attended mostly by family, close friends, and a handful of Hollywood veterans. Harry James played a muted trumpet solo at her graveside. A trembling, imperfect rendition of "You Made Me Love You." Those present said there wasn't a dry eye. In that moment, the glamour of Hollywood melted away, and what remained was something human. Regret, loss, tenderness. In death, Betty's myth only grew. Photographs of her, smiling over her shoulder, bathed in soft studio light, resurfaced across magazines and retrospectives. She became the eternal pin-up, frozen in youth, immortal in seduction. But few remembered the cost behind that photograph. The girl who had been pushed, shaped, and finally consumed by the very image that made her famous. Beneath the headlines and the nostalgia lies a deeper tragedy. One that mirrors the fate of countless women in Hollywood's golden age. Betty's story wasn't just hers. It was systemic. The industry that adored her had also orchestrated her downfall. It celebrated her legs, not her voice. Her smile, not her suffering. She was praised as every man's dream, yet denied the right to be a full human being. Her struggle with identity, love, and illness was not weakness. It was the price of survival in a world that profited from her perfection. In the years since her death, cultural historians have revisited her legacy with new eyes. They see not just a sex symbol or a wartime icon, but a woman, trapped in a contract of beauty and silence. Her life became a cautionary tale for the generations that followed. A mirror reflecting the dangers of a system that trades youth for visibility and visibility for control. And yet, through the pain, something luminous remains. Even in her final photos. Thin, pale, eyes ringed with exhaustion. There is still that glint, that impossible light. It's not glamour anymore, it's defiance. The stubborn fire of someone who refused to surrender completely. Betty Grable's legacy lives on, not just in pin-up posters or old musicals, but in the quiet rebellion of every woman who refuses to be reduced to an image. Her life asks a haunting question that still echoes through Hollywood today. How many smiles must a woman sell before she's allowed to cry? Her story ends not with tragedy, but with revelation. Behind the perfection there was pain. Behind the fame, there was fear. But beneath it all, still burning, was the courage of a woman who dared to be both fragile and unforgettable. This was not the tale of a fallen idol. It was the anatomy of sacrifice. The slow unraveling of a dream built on beauty, silence, and control. And when the lights of the studio finally dimmed, the echo that lingered wasn't applause. It was her final truth, whispered softly, defiantly into the night. I gave them everything. But I kept one thing. My story. It's really being life,